Sardar Patel College has organized a conversation with Mr. Vishnu Shankar Jain, Advocate Supreme Court, called Manthan. The reason for naming this event Manthan is because all of you are, I'm sure, aware of the great Manthan that happened in the ocean between Dev and Daitya. And we all know who is the Daitya now and which side we are going to be is what we have to choose. This room today is filled with people from different walks of life, people from different backgrounds, people representing different organizations, and people with different ideologies as well. But there is one thing for which we stand united, we stand together, which is protecting our culture and heritage. And it is for that purpose that all of us are gathered here to get to know more about what is going on in the judicial system of India and where we are headed. Our speaker today at Manthan is Mr. Vishnu Shankar Jain, a man representing each and every one of us in the journey, and we all know who is on the other side. Born in October 1986, Vishnu Ji is the son of Sri Hari Shankar Jain, an advocate himself and one of the counsels for Hindu Mahasabha in the Ayodhya case from 1989 up to 2019. Vishnu Ji, after completing law at Pune in 2010, assisted his father in the final arguments in Ayodhya case at Lucknow bench at Allahabad High Court, and also in preparing the appeal in the Supreme Court against judgment allowing 1/3 of the land to Muslims. He filed his first Wakalatnama after becoming advocate on record in Ayodhya case in pending appeal before Supreme Court, and variably assisted his father in final argument. In the year 2013 and 14, he filed a case in the Supreme Court to protect the life and liberty of a Hindu girl, and this is one of the cases that is very close to him as well, who had been kidnapped and kept at Madarsa in a village of Meerut, and thereafter the girl was freed from the clutches of the ultras. Vishnu Ji is utilizing his degree of law and has committed himself for Hindu interests, and there is a long series of work that he continues to do. We wish him our support and best wishes for the same. Somebody had sent a message saying that very aptly he is living his name, which is Vishnu Shankar Jain. If you see, it is a combination of Jain, which is brotherhood and peace. He also has Vishnu in his name, the one who takes care of the nature, the one who takes care of law and administrator while we live. And Shankar, if there is going to be time, he is ready to destroy as well. So, Vishnuji, please know that we are very proud of all that you are doing to protect our heritage, and there is a special message for you. Right?
Thank you, Vishnu Mama, to bringing our temple back.
So with this, I would request Mr. Vishnu to please come on the dais, and Mr. A.K. Vajpayee, President of Sardar Patel Alumni, to welcome him.
Sir, somebody. Sir,
Happy afternoon. I take the privilege to invite Dr. S. Rajendra ji, Chairman Sardar Patel College, to be honored by Sri Padmakar ji, alumni Sardar Patel College. Padmakar ji, please come over. Dr. S. Rajendra. सामने.
सर थोड़ा उसके हाथ सर सामने इधर सर थोड़ा मास्क निकाल
बिल्कुल लंच कर दिया चेयर का हमको पकड़ हाँ
Thank you, Padmakar ji and Dr. S. Rajendra ji. धन्यवाद. Further, I invite Sri Surendra ji Reddy, General Secretary, Sardar Patel College.
सुरेंद्र का फोटो है इसमें वो दिखा
It is honored to have Sri Jairam Ji Singh with us, former lecturer of Sardar Patel College. I invite Sri Anil Kumar Ji Vajpayee, President Alumni Sardar Patel College, to honor Jairam Ji, and we are honored today he is celebrating his birthday as well.
The uncle is very active in this age. Very active. Touch wood. Touch wood.
Vajpayee is a product of this college and Jairam Ji Singh. Thank you.
Thank you, dear. Vishnu would be answering. And once we're done with the questions that I have, the floor would be open to all of you to ask anything that you would want to clarify. But the only request is, please make sure that you ask questions that are related to the topic that we're discussing today. So Vishnu ji, welcome once again. The first question that I have is about the Ayodhya temple. Now, your father has been an integral part of the Ram Mandir fight for years. And right from the day when Sri Ram Lila Darshan was prohibited to now that the temple is underway. So what this journey has been like? I'm sure you've been following this case since you were a child to now that you're a part of this case fighting the cause as well. So what has been the entire journey like?
See, I think I am one of the very few in the country who can say that I was the lawyer for Lord Ram. It is a very rare occasion where a lawyer in such an early stage of his career, in such an early life of his career, gets an opportunity to read and assist such legal luminaries in a special matter like this. Now let me tell you, since you have asked this question, Ram Mandir case was not just a normal civil suit between two communities. It has actually set up a judicial trend, and it has given an example that if in the past there was a temple which was existing prior to creation of any mosque or any waqf, in today's independent India, in today's constitutional world, in today's constitutional India, we can get that right restored, we can get that temple restored. So Ram Mandir is an excellent example of that judicial principle. Before the verdict of Ram Mandir in 2019, whenever I used to talk to people, they used to say, "Arey kuch hona nahi hai, nothing is going to happen, the courts will linger on the matter." But ultimately the judiciary has given its verdict. Whether the Allahabad High Court or the Supreme Court, one way or the other, they have decided the issue, they have brought quietus to the issue. So this is an excellent example of the propositions of Hindu law, and as you all know, since you are all from Hyderabad, you would have heard about this proposition and this notion that once a waqf is always a waqf property. In the same way, from the Hindu legal fraternity, we used to, in the team of Mr. Parasaran and in the team of Mr. Harishankar Jain, we used to keep saying that once a property vests in the deity, it continues to remain deity's property. And let me tell you, this proposition of law has been enunciated by the Supreme Court in para 116 and 117 of the judgment of Ram Mandir. Supreme Court has very extensively dealt with this issue and said that if today you take a vow, a sacrament, if you take a vow that I will construct a temple here, whether due to effects of time, whether in the passage of time that temple is destroyed, say by earthquake, by flood or by anything, for times to come, that vow will have a legal obligation. So if any temple is destroyed by any invader, or say by any, if there is an inter-sea Hindu fight, that vow will have a legal entity and you can go to the court to restore those temples, and that's the legal proposition. Now when with this research and in Ram Mandir case, there was a problem with us as lawyers that we were not having direct evidence as to the destruction of the temple. Like I told you in Kashi case and in Mathura case, I have the Farman of Aurangzeb where on specific dates Farmans have been issued for destruction of Kashi temple and for destruction of Mathura temple. But so far as Ram Mandir is concerned, we were lacking that part of evidence where we were not having a direct documentary evidence of destruction of a temple. Because very interestingly, those 2 pages of Babar Nama when Babar visited Ayodhya are missing from the translation of Beveridge, which is known to be the official translation of Babar Nama. So when we were researching on this issue and the entire legal team was researching on this issue, it was like a war room. It was like a war room. VHP's legal team, BJP's legal team, all the people who believed in Dharma, they were all united and we were researching. And at that point of time, we took out the travelers account. That what the travelers who came to India like Nicholas Munichi and William Finch, what all they have seen at that point of time. They were Italian travelers, they were French travelers. Then in Ain Akbari in 1593, Akbar's courtmaster himself, Abul Fazl, had written that Hindus go and worship there and the temple is in ruins. So all these evidences along with the ASI report, and that's why the ASI became a crucial point, because we needed someone to tell us that whether that structure is a Hindu structure or not. And let me tell you, the ASI did extensive survey after demolition, and before demolition also. That entire campus was videographed and photographed, and there were Vara scriptures, Vara Devta was there inside the mosque. There were statues of Lord Hanuman inside the mosque, and so we all tried to prove through Hill that this can never be a mosque, because in mosque such kind of Hindu structures and Hindu's deity can never remain. And the ASI seconded our research and seconded our opinion that on all these 14 pillars, this mosque has been standing, and it is not a new construction. It's not like that Babar came, he constructed a new mosque on a plain land. ASI gave a categorical finding that this structure is not made on a new land, on a barren land. There was already a pre-existing Hindu structure on which this particular mosque was created. So then the question arose before the Supreme Court and the judiciary that if a temple has been demolished, though there is no direct evidence, but through circumstantial evidence, if a temple has been demolished and a mosque has been created, then what will be the legal remedy? can the Supreme Court or can the High Court rectify that wrong? And then specifically the Supreme Court has answered the question in affirmative and gave those portions of land to us. Now the point is this, that when all these things happened, I was very young, I was born in 1986. Now when this demolition happened on 6 December 1992, on the same very day my grandmother had expired, and my father, after completing the Tervi on 19, on 20th of December he filed a petition in the Allahabad High Court saying that you have to open the darshan of Lord Ram. It was a very important petition because at that point of time this plea wouldn't have been taken by Hindus, though it's a very radical stand. Many people would have said that on 6th December the structure has been demolished, and after 13 days you go to the court and say that you have a right to worship there. What joke it is. But the people have criticized us left and right. But then we held our ground. We were strong on our research. We had at that point of time taken the original pages of the constitution, and we proved through our arguments, my father proved through his arguments in 1992 on 10 days of hearing before Lucknow bench of Allahabad High Court. There was a special sitting of Lucknow bench of the Allahabad High Court from 20th of December till 1st of January 1993 that Lord Ram is a constitutional entity and no one can stop darshan of Lord Ram. It's a legal right, it's a constitutional right, and let me tell you, it is because of that order and that judgment that till this date it always had an persuasive value for the present judgment also. Because if you are not the person who were worshipping there, you are not the person who was having claim there, you are not the person who was going there and paying homage every day, then people would have forgotten due to flux of time. So this was a it was a very big experience, it was a very big victory for my family, and very interesting experience I want to share with you. Since now time has passed, I can share it with you. When this order was passed of Justice Tillery on 1st of January 1993, the courtroom was full with members of the other community. It was full. There were hardly any Hindus in the courtroom. That time, that much of vigor and fever for dharma was not there. So Justice Tillery called my father in his chamber. He said, "Mr. Jain, come, I want to talk to you soon." So he sent his peon. He said that come and meet me in my chamber. Then he said, how you are going back home? He said, I'll take an auto and I'll leave. He said, have you gone mad? Have you gone mad? He said, come, I'll drop you. Then he dropped my father on Hazratganj Chauraha near a temple. He said, from here you go. And his son right now is working as a judge of the Lucknow bench. But that's a legacy which Justice Tillery left. 2-3 years back he was arguing in the Supreme Court in Ram Janmabhoomi case. He's now no more. But these are the legacies which the generations we are sitting in front of me have left for us to be carried forward. So Ram Mandir has been an amazing experience. Once I joined law in 2010, that time on 30th of September, you know that the final judgment of Ram Mandir came and extensive hearing was going on. So the moment I was doing my law graduation, I was preparing for my exam, side by side I was researching on Ram Mandir case with my father. I used to come to Delhi and go to archives and search various books, what Akbar has done, read Quran, read various hadiths, read various aspects of Gita, read various parts of Ramayana, meet Swami Rambhadracharya, take his blessings, take his lot. Because this was the case where you needed knowledge on scriptures, this was a case where you needed knowledge on Quranic law, and during the course of argument everything was cited. The existence of Lord Ram was also questioned in this case. Rajiv Dhawan went on to argue that Ramayana is a kavya. The Congress government, as you all know, has given an affidavit that Lord Ram is not existing. It's a myth. So all these things, when these kind of attacks were there on our devotion, on our worship, on our deity, then it was very incumbent on us to have a very intrigued and extensive research so far as the existence of Lord Ram is concerned, and through Ramayana, through the blessings of Swami Rambhadracharya, through various aspects of Quranic law, we have won the case. And it was an amazing experience for me as a lawyer to join that legal team, to get that opportunity to research about Lord Ram, to read Quran, to research various aspects of CPC, to research various aspects of Indian Evidence Act, to know that historical books are of value in these kind of cases, and by virtue of section 53 of the Indian Evidence Act, it can be proved that these historical books have a legal value. So it was an amazing experience, and I had taken a vow that when I pass my AOR exam and if Ram Mandir is pending as an issue in the Supreme Court, this will be my first case to file Wakalatnama, and by grace of God I got that opportunity, and we filed Wakalatnama on behalf of Hindu Mahasabha, and we were in the team of the VHP and the Ram Janmabhoomi Nyas, and we fought shoulder to shoulder, and ultimately the victories of the entire community.
Absolutely, I think there's no denying on that the efforts that have gone into the entire proceedings, the research that you've spoken about. I think going through so many scriptures, trying to get information which is dated so many years back, through the traveler's log and all of that is a very extensive effort that you're putting, and all of us are very happy that it has paid off. If I have to ask you about one particular legality which was very difficult during the proceedings of this Ayodhya case, what would that be?
See, the very crucial aspect which had transpired in the Ayodhya case was that since the history travelled back to 1528, and in 2019 we were asking the Indian courts to adjudicate as to what happened in 1528, and there was an aspect about demolition, that what proof you have about demolition, because at that point of time, as I told you, apart from the evidence of traveller's account, apart from the evidence of Ain Akbari, Abul Fazl, there was no direct evidence which can prove that actually there was a temple which was demolished, as is the case in Mathura and Kashi. In Mathura and Kashi there is ample evidence to prove that a temple was demolished. So the judicial scrutiny and the judges of the High Court and the Supreme Court had continuously asked us this question, that whether any temple was demolished and do you have any direct document on that. And I had as a student of law, as a student of history, gone to various archives. I had taken out a book which is very interesting. It's called Tuzuke-Babri. It was in Persian, so I disguised myself as a research scholar, and I went to the archives. I said, please give me this book, it's very important for my research work. Then ultimately they gave me that document. I got it translated, and in that also those 2 pages were missing when the Babur actually reached Ayodhya. So actually to prove that Babur was having a tendency of demolition of a Hindu temple, we actually went very in depth in Baburnama. And let me tell you, Babur was a habitual drinker. So in Baburnama he has written, it's a very interesting passage. He said that today I am taking a vow that I will break all these glasses of wine, and as the glasses of wine have broken today, in the same way the idols of idolaters will be broken. So with this vow, he had come from Samarkand to Ayodhya. So we had went ahead and tried to convince the judges with the intention of the ruler at that point of time. And then according to the various travellers' accounts, Ain Akbari and William Finch and Mununchi Ayat, and through Ayodhya Mahatma we proved that in Ayodhya Mahatma it is said that whoever has worshipped in whoever has taken bath in Saryu river and has worshipped Ram Janmabhoomi will get moksha. Apart from that, we took help of Sikh Dharma Shastra. Guru Sakhi was there, in which Guru Nanak had visited Ram Mandir in 1510 before demolition, and he had taken bath in Saryu river and worshipped Ram temple. So we tried to prove through this circumstantial evidence. So this was one of the most crucial points, and this was one of the most testing judicial scrutinies which has ever happened, where the courts in the country have gone traveled 500-600 years back to see what happened at that point of time, and the literature also was missing. So that was a tough part, and to overcome it was very difficult.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that, Vishnuji. The next question that I would want to ask you about would be, you brought up Kashi and Mathura, right?
Yeah.
So there is this Gyan Vapi mosque which is there, and we all know that there is a lot of structural evidence as well. If you look at pictures through Google's or on the internet, you'll be able to see that the structure very clearly shows you that there was a temple there before the mosque was constructed. So what is it that you would want to share about that particular case, and how is it that you're going about it? What is the plan?
I would like to share with you the Farman of Aurangzeb, and I think after reading the Farman, which just take hardly 1 minute, nothing much has to be said. That Farman is very self-evident as to how a temple was demolished. And let me tell you, and kindly permit me to read that Farman. It is very, very interesting. Once a person reads this Farman, it will be so evident that there was a temple which was existing in prior in time, and it was demolished. So this Farman I am reading, and this Farman is very easily available. It is there in the book of History of India. It is written by a famous historian, H.M. Eliot and John Dawson. In his book, this Farman has been quoted, and you can read this Farman, and I am just quoting what they have translated from Persian to English. And let me read this for you. And this is what I am saying, that this kind of Farman was not there so far as Ram Mandir case is concerned, but this kind of Farman is there for Kashi and for Mathura, and that's the most clinching piece of evidence which we have got to prove our case, that yes, there was a pre-existing temple which was demolished. And I am also telling you that no Muslim historian or scholar can ever tell you that a mosque can be constructed after demolishing a Hindu temple. If you will ask them that can a mosque be constructed after demolishing a Hindu temple, their answer will be no. If he is an Islamic scholar, he will say mosque can only be created on a valid waqf. For a mosque to be created, there is first important thing is to be a valid waqf. And for to be a valid waqf, the most important credential and the most important test is that it should be the property of the waqif. If this particular school belongs to me, is under my ownership, then only I can create a valid waqf. And then only on this particular property a mosque can be created. If this property does not belong to me, if I am an encroacher, and if a mosque is created, the namaz offered in this mosque will not be acceptable to Allah. These are the Islamic tenets. This is the Islamic and Quranic law on the point. And with this perspective, kindly see the Farman at that point of time, what these historians have written. Now I am quoting the Farman. It is of 18th of April 1669. It reached the ear of His Majesty, the Protector of the Faith, that in the province of Tata, Multan and Banaras, but especially in the latter, which is Banaras, foolish Brahmins were in the habit of expounding frivolous books in their schools, and that students and learners, Muslims as well as Hindus, went there, even from long distances, led by a desire to become acquainted with the wicked sciences they taught. The director of the faith consequently issued orders to all the governors of the province to infidels, and they were strictly enjoined to put an stop to the teaching and practicing of the idolaters' forms of worship. On 15th Rabiul Akhir, which is 2nd of September 1669, it was reported to His Religious Majesty, leader of the Unitarians, that in obedience to the order, the government officer had destroyed the temple of Vishwanath at Banaras. So this is the Farman of Aurangzeb, and this Farman everyone, all the countrymen, every individual can get in the book which I have quoted, History of India, written by Eliot and Mr. Dawson. And this is a very interesting piece, and like this we have a Farman so far as Mathura is concerned, and that Farman also, I'll read it for you. It's translated by a very famous historian, by Jadunath Sarkar. He is a very famous historian. He has translated this farman, and let me read it for you. So far as Mathura is concerned, we also have a farman. And what does this farman say? So now this farman for Mathura is there in Majlis-e Alamgiri, and this Majlis-e Alamgiri has been translated by Jadunath Sarkar. It was in Persian and it has been translated into English. And what does this farman say? Let me read it for you. It says, during this month of Ramzan, 1080 Hijri, January, February 1670, the emperor, the reviver of the faith of the Prophet, issued orders for demolition of Deura of Keshav Rai in Mathura. In short time, the destruction of this strong foundation of infidelity was accomplished, and on its entire site a lofty mosque was built. The idols, large and small, of the temple were brought to Agra and buried under the steps of mosque of Begum Shahi. In order to be continually trodden upon, the name of Mathura was changed to Islamabad, and it is this what I have read is Majlis-e Alamgiri, page number 95 and 96, translated by Jadunath Sarkar. So in this background, with this legal and historical research, coupled with various arguments of CPC, coupled with various arguments of representative suit, coupled with the finding of Ram Mandir case in para 116, as I quoted before, we went to the court and we have requested the court for restoration. And one of the very interesting pleas of in Ram Mandir case was taken by Mr. Harishankar Jain, my father, before the High Court, and Mr. Parasaran also in the Supreme Court, was of historical wrong. That whether if any ruler has destroyed a temple in the past, how can it be rectified? Court asked us this question, that how can after 500 years, 600 years, Mr. Parasaran, Mr. Jain, what are you asking us to do? That after 600 years you want us to undo what Aurangzeb and Akbar have and Babur have done? It was very unique for them. So at that point of time, Mr. Parasaran and Mr. Harishankar Jain took the attention of the Honorable Supreme Court and the High Court to Article 13(1) of the Constitution. Article 13(1) of the Indian Constitution says that all laws in force in the territory of India before the commencement of the Constitution, if they hit any of the fundamental rights, they will be declared unconstitutional. So today these farmans of Aurangzeb in Kashi and Mathura, by virtue of Article 13(1), they are unconstitutional, and therefore our argument, our case has a legal value, and therefore all these cases have been admitted by the court and notices have been issued. Now the matter is sub judice before the civil court of Mathura and Varanasi, and we hope that through the support of the general masses, through the blessings of the general Hindu masses who believe in dharma, who believe in restoration of these places, we will be able to achieve it. The only thing I need in all these cases is an early hearing, a day-to-day hearing, a fast-track trial, and I have full hope that we will be able to win it. So far as case of Kashi is concerned, we have lot of material so far as the Hindu scriptures are concerned. So far as Mathura is concerned, we have unraveled the conspiracy which went on to prove that initially it was a property of the trust, and the compromise which has happened on 12th of October 1968 has been obtained by fraud, and so all those aspects are there which will come in relevant point of time. But as a lawyer, as a practicing advocate, as an advocate being in part of the legal team of Ram Mandir case, I am assured and I feel that we will get justice from the Indian court someday.
Absolutely. I think all of us hope the same as well, and we wish you the very best that these two cases that you're fighting as well also are in favor of us. You spoke about Waqf as well, Vishnuji. We'll come to that a little later, but before that I wanted you to touch upon a little on the Places of Worship Act.
See, very interestingly, this Places of Worship Act and secularism was commented upon by the Supreme Court in Ram Mandir case, while giving 5 acres of land to the Muslim community in Ram Mandir case also. Let me tell you, they have not lost their case before the Supreme Court. they have been given an alternative piece of land. So the Supreme Court has commented on the Places of Worship Act as well as the principles of secularism. Now what we have done after the judgment of 9th of November 2019 is, we have conceptually tried to demolish the theory of secularism and we have tried to demolish the theory of Places of Worship Act. And how we have done it? See, first we have said, now let me tell you a brief background about Places of Worship Act. Places of Worship Act 1991 was enacted by Narasimha Rao government, and it said that whatever is the situation of any mosque or temple, I am just explaining you in a simpler language, whatever is the situation of any mosque or temple, on 15th of August 1947, that will remain to continue, and no legal suit, no appeal or no suit can be filed for restoration of any such property. And from the purview of Places of Worship Act, only Ram Mandir was kept as an exception, and therefore this suit which was filed by Gopal Singh Visharad in Ram Mandir case in 1950, that continued to be tried by the High Court in 1989, and finally the Allahabad High Court gave the verdict in 2010, and then finally the Supreme Court gave its opinion on 9th of November 2019. But the fact remained that the constitutional validity of Places of Worship Act for 30 years was never challenged by anyone. So when this Ram Mandir case happened and we came to know that the Supreme Court has commented upon Places of Worship Act, we went into the merits of the matter, we analyzed and we understood that Places of Worship Act was not an issue in Ram Mandir case. It was a title dispute between the two communities, and then we said that Places of Worship Act section 4 is unconstitutional. And why we said so? That L. Chandra Kumar and various judgments of the Supreme Court have said that right to approach the court is part of a fundamental right. You cannot take away the judicial remedy of a community. And what the Places of Worship Act has done is, it has taken away the right of the Hindu community to approach the court. Now today if a temple has been demolished before 15th of August 1947, and I want my right of restoration by virtue of Article 13(1) and various researches which I have told you, the Places of Worship Act bars me to do so. It says that you cannot approach the court, and on that legal footing we have challenged the matter in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has issued notice in this aspect. This matter is pending in the Supreme Court, and I am completely sure and I completely believe that this is one of the strongest case on judicial precedents and principles, and when this case will come for final arguments before the Supreme Court, we will win. But now the question which will arise in your mind is that if Places of Worship Act is there in existence, how you are contesting Mathura case and how you are contesting Kashi case, because it bars any such contest. And perhaps this is one of the arguments, this is one of the limbs of the arguments of the Muslim community also. So actually it's a matter of interpretation, and here is where our interpretation comes. The Places of Worship Act section 4 very interestingly uses the word religious character. That whatever is the religious character on 15th of August 1947 will remain to be the same. So when Kashi case was filed in 1991, this argument came up and we said that the religious character of that premises is a Hindu character, and the mosque has been built after destruction of a temple, and in the mosque which is existing in Kashi as of now, and various historians have said so, who have passed out from professors of Banaras Hindu University, whether it's James Bishop and other historians also, they have said that that structure has all the ingredients of a Hindu structure, and it has been demolished after it has been constructed after, partly constructed after demolishing a Hindu temple. So we said that the religious character has to be determined of this place, and let me tell you that from past 30 years on this issue of religious character of Kashi, the matter is pending from the trial court till the High Court. Now the judgment has been reserved by the High Court from past 8 months, the High Court has not delivered the verdict. We hope that the High Court will deliver its verdict on Kashi case very soon and determine that what's the religious character. But we have won the matter from the district judge, and the interpretation which I am giving you today, the same interpretation has been given by the district judge. They said that whatever is the religious character, that has to be seen in the suit, and for that evidence has to be led. So this is so far as Kashi's case is concerned. So far as Mathura case is concerned, if any one of you will ever visit Mathura Shri Krishna Janmabhoomi, you will find the same thing, that the mosque has been not made on a barren piece of land. There is a pre-existing structure. And if I am wrong, I will ask you, and you can ask everyone also, that let's have a SI survey on Mathura and let's see whether beneath that mosque is there any Karagar of Kans or not. उसके नीचे क्या कोई और स्ट्रक्चर है कि नहीं है? अगर नहीं है तो हमारा बिलीफ गलत है, पर अगर उसके नीचे स्ट्रक्चर है, then it has all the characters. The religious character of that place will be a Hindu character, and it can never change by virtue of para 116 of the Ram Mandir judgment which I told you. So this is the two sides of Places of Worship Act. One is the constitutional validity of Places of Worship Act, and the other is the interpretation of the word religious character which occurs in section 4 of the Places of Worship Act. And one more interpretation I have, which is the third interpretation, and which is a very, you can say, sound political or legal solution. The government of state, the state government, by virtue of Article 254 subclause 2, can amend the Places of Worship Act, and where the exemption is given to Ayodhya, they can add Mathura and Kashi. And if it receives the assent of the president, it is the law of the land. So this legal hurdle which we are facing from past 30 years on the issue of interpretation, that whether it's a religious structure, is a Hindu structure or not, that goes out. Then we come to the merits of the matter. So I would request the government through your medium, and you must also in tandem ask the government to make an amendment in the Places of Worship Act so far as these two important places are concerned, that is Kashi and Mathura, because these are our core. These are our essential values where Bhagwan Shri Krishna have taken birth, and where Kashi being first of the cities, and in my earlier lecture in that seminar, I had told very specifically and dealt it so specifically and extensively that what's the importance of Kashi through Skand Puran, through Shiv Mahapuran, through Rig Ved, and that's why these two places are very sacred to us. So the legislature in all its wisdom can exempt these two places from the purview of Places of Worship Act. So this is the third interpretation of this worship.
Thank you for sharing that. But then, what will it mean for other temples, Vishnuji? These are just a few handful temples that we have recognized so far. But do you think this act, as far as I understand from a layman's perspective, I don't think they were supportive. I don't think they're going to allow us to do any further restoration to other temples. So, what do you think about that?
See, that's why I told you the constitutional validity of this act is under challenge in the Supreme Court. And ultimately, if we win, so far as the constitutional validity of Places of Worship Act is concerned, the legal doors for all the temples in the country will open. The only bar for right of restoration for all the temples in the country is Places of Worship Act 1991. And you must ask a question to yourself also, and I ask a question to myself. On 15th August 1947, we just got independence. We have realized our rights now after 70 years. So why is the cut-off date of 15th August 1947? And why you want to bring a quietus to this issue that if a temple has been demolished in the past, you can't have a right of restoration? I am saying that if a mosque has been demolished in the past, they should also have a right of restoration. But why the Muslim communities against the validity, they are taking shelter of Places of Worship Act 1991? They should say that yes, the Quran says that if a temple has been demolished in the past and it was a mosque from very inception, and if Hindu community has destroyed it, we have a right of restoration. They can't say so because Hindus have never demolished any mosque. We do not have that tendency of interfering with the religious beliefs of any community. The factual background is that if anything which has been demolished in the country, it's only a temple which has been demolished, as you have rightly said, and therefore I feel that when in the passage of time Places of Worship Act will be declared unconstitutional. It is at that point of time the right of restoration of all the temples will revive, and at that point of time we need a strong legal team in all the parts of country, not just one Vishnu Shankar Jain. And that's why I am here before you, that many people like us should be created small. See, lawyer big or small doesn't matter. The research of a lawyer matters. The arguments of a lawyer matter. If a person has an in-depth desire to restore his temple in his locality, then through his research he can, and through the medium of civil courts he can do it. And ultimately that's the most important thing. People ask me that you want to always be, there are various kind of allegations which people say that you are so young and you are fighting for Kashi and Mathura, it is just for your profile and just for your biodata you are doing it. So I must tell you that when I joined this profession, I was not in need of any profile or anything. I had lot of option to go into corporate litigation, earn lot of money, take a senior gown, become a high court judge and various things and go away. But I chose this path because I read the history. I chose this path because I read and understood the importance of a temple in the Hindu society. And if you will see the earlier Vedic era and the eras in which our temple were the institutions of power, the Somnath Mandir, the Ram Janmabhoomi Mandir, Tirumala Tirupati Mandir, the entire communities associated with the temple, like the churches today, the temple used to be a semi-government or a partial government which used to provide education, which used to provide food, which used to provide religious activities, which used to have social gatherings, and people used to go there and connect, and that's why so much big mandaps and all were built in the temple, and that's why the first thing which the invaders did was to come and demolish our temple. And therefore if the Hindu society has to revive, it has to be only by the revival of a temple. If the temples will revive, if the glory of our temples and our deities will revive, we will automatically have a sense of confidence. Today Ram Mandir is getting built. After 2 years down the lane we will see a Bhavya Ram Mandir there. From now on the people have started connecting, they want to go there, they want to meet up, they want to buy property there, they want to be spiritually and devotionally connected, and that's the importance of the temple. And therefore when these arguments are made that let a hospital be built, let a playground be built, all those arguments do not attract me, because the temples are the core and essential value of an idolater. Yes, I am an idolater. I worship the idols, and therefore no one has the right to destroy my idol. And the way I want to seek my spiritual guidance, if I get spiritual blessings by worshipping a temple, by visiting a temple, no one has the right to demolish it and destroy it. And therefore me and my father have taken it as a mission in our life, that the only thing which we are concerned with is all these aspects of law, and through legal fraternity and through legal battles we will try to get restored as many temples as possible in our lifetime. We are a small team. It is not possible for us to fight for every temple in the country, but let me tell you, it's not just that Kashi and Mathura we are fighting. There are many other temples which are not very famous also, for which we are fighting. We have filed civil suits, we leave the practice in the Supreme Court, we go to the trial court, we attend various hearings, but more and more people in the society have to get educated on this aspect, and that's why I am here before you.
Absolutely, thank you so much for sharing that, Vishnuji. We did not discuss much on Waqf board and the related amendments and all of that. So is there something that you would want to share about
See,
that?
the very important aspect of Waqf Act which I want to today share with you is certain aspects of Waqf Act which make it completely unconstitutional. Now the Waqf Act section 40 gives the power to Waqf board to declare any property, whether of trust or of society, as Waqf property. And the notice also will not be issued to the person concerned. For example, God forbidden, I am just giving as an example, if this college, sometimes the Waqf board has a reason to believe that this college is a Waqf property, they will hold an inquiry and they will not send a notice to you that, sir, we are considering this college to be a Waqf property. They will send a notice to the organization with which you are registered, They may in turn send it to you or not, we don't know. And ultimately they may declare it as a Waqf property. For your kind information, Taj Mahal is also declared as a Waqf property. And the Archaeological Survey of India is under appeal in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is asking them time and again that please give us the Waqf deed made by Shah Jahan. Has Shah Jahan done any Waqf? If Shah Jahan has done any Waqf, please give us the Waqf deed. From past 2 years, their lawyers are taking adjournment. So the point is that the Waqf Act 1995 gives enormous powers to the Waqf board to declare any property as Waqf property, and I have no problem at all that if Musalman Waqf Act 1923 is in operation. That was the earlier law and period of time when Muslims were given a right to manage their own property and there was no quarrel. But so far as you say that you have a right to declare any property of any community as Waqf property, there is where the quarrel starts, because from that point of time a special tribunal, a special setup, a special system is created for you. Under section 28 of the Waqf Act, the district magistrate is bound by the orders of the Waqf board. I ask a question to myself whether such power is given to any trust, any mud. Under section 52 or 54 of the Waqf Act, the Waqf has the power to remove the encroachers from the land. I ask myself a question that whether such power is given to a trust or a mud. If there is any encroachment on temple land, we have to file a civil suit and have a long battle. And for them, we don't have any power to issue a direction to the DM or the SSP. They have the power to issue directions and get the encroachment removed. Does our pujaris and mahants come within the purview of public servant? The answer is no. Their pujaris, their mahants, their mutawallis, their people of Waqf come within the purview of public servant. If it means that if you touch them, you have committed an offence under the IPC. For us to file a case in the civil suit, in the civil court, there is a particular limitation, particular time frame within which we have to come. Under section 107 of the Waqf Act, there is no limitation. They can come in the court at any point of time whenever they think that it's a Waqf property. So all these aspects of the Waqf Act make Waqf Act completely discriminatory and unconstitutional. And kindly see the irony why I am here before you. Kindly compare the Waqf Act, and it's not very technical. It may sound very technical, but if you go home and Google it and read it on your iPhone and mobile and whatever, you will understand it is not very technical. Kindly compare Waqf Act with Places of Worship Act. I just now told you that Places of Worship Act section 4 bars the judicial remedy, and simultaneously same government, Narasimha Rao government, enacted the Places of Worship Act, and same government enacted the Waqf Act 1995. Under the Waqf Act, you have given them the power to declare any property as Waqf property, and if someone is aggrieved, he will go to the tribunal, and then he will go to the High Court, and then he will go to the Supreme Court. So for them, there is entire judicial process and judicial remedy which is open, and for us, there is no judicial remedy. You cannot even contest the the case in the court. So what option we have? If we sit on the roads and take law in our own hands, they will say that you have violated the constitution, you have violated the legal norms, but you are choking the society. The point is that you are choking the Hindu society. If you do not give us the right to approach the court and take the judicial remedies, then what other option we have? And therefore I have said that the Waqf Act 1995 as well as the Places of Worship Act 1991 is completely unconstitutional, and it has a bearing on Kashi and Mathura case, and someday the government and the people who are in power and in charge, they have to think very extensively on all these points. I may sound as a young lawyer, but all these researches and all these points, you may take it that I am just a spokesperson. Many senior lawyers and legal luminaries have thought on it, and these matters are pending consideration in the Supreme Court.
Very nice, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you've shared a lot of information, and I myself have got to know many things, especially about the Places of Worship Act and the Waqf Code. I think I'm done with the questions that I had for you. We'll open the floor to any questions that the audience would want to ask. See many hands going up.
Mr. Vishnu Jain, good evening to you.
जी
I am almost an ardent fan of yours. Because I see every debate of yours on Times Now and Republic also. My only question is, does the Hindu community or the Hindustanis have been bullied to that extent to prove their own identity in their own land, their ethnic values, their customs, their mythology, everything? They are made to prove in their own land, and we are falling a trap to this external forces. My other question is, before Islam, before Muhammad Prophet, do I consider that there was no Islam? Do I concur? Do I come to a conclusion telling that there was no Islam before Prophet Muhammad? And the second point is, before Jesus, the same thing holds good. Before Jesus, do I concur that there was no Christianity? But can anyone say that before Ram, before Lakshman, or before Krishna, or before this thing, there was no Hinduism? Can they argue on this point? I am sure not.
You are right.
Because our own culture is so old, the Sanatana Dharma as we call it, pre-Vedic ages, the Upanishads. Who has written this? There is no proof. Even today, I mean, it has come to us without any hard disk, without any pen drives. All this has come to us for ages together. My only question is, I think, now maybe I may sound a little radical, but then I would definitely go out of the way and say, we have to take a proactive approach regarding this particular bullying aspect. Now we say, this far no further. Please stop it. As no other country in the world, for example, Makkah, Medina, now if I question, you prove your ethnicity, you prove your authenticity of your Makkah extinction there, will they oblige? I think they'll say, okay, Baba, this is your logo. And second point is, that suppose if I question the same Vatican city, telling that what is your status? Now, why do you, we are doing so much unnecessary work. All that the youngsters today want is, now this far, no further. Let Hindu Samaj wake up. Because it is a wake-up call for all of us, and we have to stand steadfastly to see that, this bullying act is, we have to stop. Thank you.
See, sir, you are absolutely right. And let me tell you, it also doesn't give us much of pleasure to drag all these issues in court and then ultimately fight it out for years to come. Because once you take up a case and you file it in court, then the duty of the client is over and the duty of the lawyer starts. You can't, and that too in such cases where the entire society is watching you on each and every day. So it's not a pleasurable exercise for us. The feelings which you have, the same feelings which we have. But the problem is, what is the option we have? If we do not approach the courts, where should we go? If we approach the government, and if the government says that yes, do you think by your imagination that the government will say that Kashi and Mathura we are giving to Hindus one fine morning? In the secular setup, either this constitution goes, that's a different story altogether. If this constitution is existing, the other community will ask a question that, sir, you have not given me right to be heard. You are not a judiciary. The matter, even if it is not in the judiciary, the parliament cannot decide that what are the rights of Muslims. Parliament cannot make a decision, and therefore I am saying that what Gopal Singh Visharat did in 1950, ultimately in 2019 we have got a verdict. We do not know if this Samaj is not awakened. I have filed a suit, my grandchildren may contest it and they may get a verdict. But every day we are getting delayed. If I don't file the suit, I will be barred by law, I will be barred by limitation, and ultimately my generations will ask that, boss, what you have done for the society. And therefore I am just telling you that it is not that we are filing these cases and we are taking contributions from the society. I have openly declared that I don't want a single penny from anyone so far as Kashi, Mathura, workout and all these things are concerned. We are doing it from our own pocket, and we will take it to a logical conclusion till the last breath of my life. It's not that I am here in front of you or before anyone else. I have done so many webinars also. It's not that we have asked for any contribution that please donate because we are fighting this case. We have said that don't donate. The only thing which you have to donate is that create awareness through social media and ask the government that kindly speed it up. That's the only thing which I am requesting you. And it's our compulsion that we have to approach the court. we are not getting any fun in approaching the courts, and if the government is with us, they can file an affidavit in the court and say that yes, so far as our stand is clear, it is very concerned, it is very clear that we give all these lands to Hindus. And let me tell you, in Kashi case, the British government has taken this stand. In 1810, the district magistrate Watson had said that the Hindus have regained the Kashi and kindly give it back to the Hindus. The British government in the suit filed by Deen Muhammad in 1936 has taken the stand that yes, this property belonged to the Hindus. So today the government will not take such a stand, and if they want to take such a stand, the floor is open for them. But all these disputes have to be decided by court. It is a compulsion, and it is a compulsory exercise which we are doing. No one is getting pleasure out of it. Ultimately, if it is declared as a Hindu Rashtra and this constitution goes and ultimately everything is declared, then it is well enough. Then you are right, then there is no point going and proving our title and our belief. But as of now, we are under the regime of the present constitution. This exercise has to be undertaken.
Vishnuji, the 76th Amendment of Constitution, the secular and socialistic words included in the Constitution. Is it legal or illegal? One. And second one, if it is legal, this state is secular, why the Hindu temples maintained by the government of governments? These two questions.
See, first of all, so far as the aspect of 76th Amendment is concerned, let me tell you that I have challenged the constitutional validity of 76th Amendment before the Supreme Court. It is pending consideration, and the argument which we have taken before the Supreme Court is that people can never be secular. It is the government which has to be secular. Now what does the preamble say? We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, social, secular, democratic republic to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic and political liberty of thought, blah 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 blah. And it ends by saying that we on this 26th day of November 1949 do hereby adopt, enact and give to ourselves this constitution. So our argument before the Supreme Court is that it is the people who have taken the oath on 26th of November 1949 to be sovereign democratic republic. That oath has already been taken. Today I take an oath in front of you. That time, that spur of the moment is gone. I can't after 20 years say that okay, in Sardar Patel College I again amend my oath and I will insert these two words. So that is one limb of the argument, and the other limb of the argument is that people are never secular. We as Hindus have a right to believe that our dharma is supreme. The way of life, the what we have been taught by the gurus, and my Lord Shiva, my Bhagavan Krishna is the greatest, and their idea and their path is the greatest through which we will attain salvation and moksha. The Muslims may believe that Quranic concept is the best to achieve salvation. The Christians may believe that their Bible is the best way to achieve salvation. So everyone will believe that they are supreme. So people can never be secular. So that's why we have said that the word we the people of India having solemnly resolved is incorrect, because the people can never be secular. It is the government which has to be secular, and therefore this amendment has to be struck down. It is unconstitutional. Apart from that, the sitting judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Rohinton Nariman, that article is also very easily available on Google. He has also said that it is a superfluous exercise to add these two words in the constitution, because the secular concept is already there in Article 14 and 15 and 27. When you are saying that you will not take taxpayers' money to encourage any religion, when you are saying that there will be no discrimination on the basis of any religion, so there is no need for adding secular word in the constitution. So it's a superfluous word, and it's the most misinterpreted and misused word in the Indian constitution, and therefore we have challenged it. And the second part of your question, which is on the footing that whether the government can take control over the temples, I have a very different opinion on it. See, the problem is that until and unless the Hindu society as a whole is spiritually awakened, till that time we cannot afford to give our temples to the Hindus only. there will be so much of infight, and ultimately the temple will not be existing, only the interested persons will be there. I was the part of Hindu Mahasabha, which is one of the political parties found by Veer Savarkar, and the only mistake I think Mr. Savarkar, Pujni Savarkar ji has done is to make that building in Reading Road of New Delhi. It's a very huge building, it's a very huge property, and till date, after he has left, he never knew that this will be the harsh, this will be the situation of Hindu Mahasabha. People are infighting. There are so many presidents. Every now and then you will see that there is a president of Hindu Mahasabha. Everyone is fighting for that property and that land. Ultimately, there is no Hindu Mahasabha. There is only that property, and whoever occupies that property is the owner. So, if you will give, suppose and if we take your question, imagine a situation where Tirupati Balaji is not at all under the government control. It is given to some individuals like us. There will be so much of infight. That's why I am saying that until unless we are spiritually awakened and trained, and Hindu society is going in tandem in a disciplined manner under a particular Shankaracharya or under a particular Guru, it is not possible to give this to an individual. It is very fancy argument to say that why government is controlling temples. All right, government doesn't control. If we will control, we will be worse than them. This is the reality which we have to accept. So we have to, I am not saying that whatever I am saying is the final aspect or final view on the matter, but there is a lot of manthan which has to be done on how our temple has to be administered.
Good evening, good evening audience. I'm Ajit Mathur. I have got a small question that work policy what the previous government has adopted in 1995. Can it be abolished now by the present government?
Yes, when Article 370 can be abolished by a stroke of pen, Waqf Act is a very smaller statute in terms of it. It's a statute by the Parliament. Article 370 was a constitutional aspect which was taken by 2/3 of the majority of Parliament. So definitely Waqf Act can be declared unconstitutional and it can be repealed by the present government. The only thing is the need that we tell the government that kindly repeal Waqf Act, because the Andhra Pradesh High Court has said that after defence and railway, Waqf is the third in number. The largest number of land after defence and railway is of Waqf Board. So we have to awaken the people, we have to be united, and you do not need leaders for it, sir. The only problem with Hindu society is that whenever someone raises any voice, we say that okay, you become a leader, and then ultimately that leader has his own dreams that I want to become Raj Sabha. This nothing. Social media is the best thing. You just every day let everything be organic. Today I am before you. It's not planned. It's just organic. So let the revolution for Waqf Act be organic, and the society will dominate and tell that yes, Waqf Act is unconstitutional. Have you ever seen a cricket match? The people who go and they become spectators in the cricket match, does anyone tell them that cheer for India? Out of the spur of the moment it comes within the people that we have to cheer for India, for Sachin or for etc. etc. Like that, so much talk and discussion and deliberation has to be there on Waqf Act that from the every corner of the country it says that Waqf Act has to be repealed, and that's what the achievement we all have to contribute.
Sir, one question. See, firstly, I just want clarification whether Places of Worship Bill is a bill or an amendment.
It's an act. It's an act in operation. Places of Worship Act 1991.
Because if it is amendment, it can override Article 13.
It's not an amendment. It's an act.
Okay.
It's an act in operation.
Sir, secondly, just I wanted to know, besides the Farman of Aurangzeb, what are the other evidences you have in case of Mathura and Kashi? And my final question, is Mr. Sai Deepak along with you in this case?
Sai Deepak is not along with me in this case, but we have a very good working rapport, we are very good friends. But so far as these two aspects you have said, in my earlier session I have dealt extensively with the evidences which I have on Kashi, like Skand Puran is there, we have the Shastric law. Apart from Shastric law, we have the evidence of the civil suit, we have the arguments on the UP Kashi Vishwanath Act 1983, we have the judgments of the Supreme Court, and so far as Mathura is concerned, we have lot of documentation to prove that the compromise which happened on 12th of October 1968 is unconstitutional. So there is lot of proof. I am in a little bit of hurry, I have a flight to catch, so I am little sorry.
We'll take one more last question with you.
Last question.
One more last
We
question.
are very happy, sir, with your depth of knowledge and your fluent English, and all the audience is completely hypnotized by the depth of knowledge and the clarity by which you explained everything. I have only two small questions, sir. OSC is the MP here in Hyderabad. He is telling that Ram has not born. There is no evidence that Ram has born. So what is the question of Ram Mandir? And again he told that Lanka bridge which Ram has built, Vaman Sena built, that also is an imaginative story. And some party also supporting it. And second question is, our BJP also has told that Ram Mandir is not in our manifesto. So what about Kashi and Mathura? We don't know. They have also always turned their place. So please tell that whether Ram is born or he is imaginative.
See, these kind of questions were raised in Ram Janmabhoomi hearing, and we had referred to the Ramayana written by Maharshi Valmiki and Vedyas. All these Ramayans were referred, where it was said that Prakat Bhayo Gopala. So I am asking a question to myself: why does Supreme Court celebrate Ram Navami if Ram is not born? Why there is holiday on Ram Navami in the calendars of the Supreme Court? Why there is holiday in the calendars of the government on Ram Navami? We believe that Ram is born, and our belief is not justiciable. If I believe that in this stage, in this mic, my God is there, I have a right to worship this bottle also. And I don't have to justify it to anyone. So I don't care what Mr. Owaisi is talking or what he says about my deity, and I don't want to comment on the other aspect that what his belief is. I don't want to degrade to that level. But if he believes that Lord Ram is not in existence, he may believe so. I am a believer, and I believe that Lord Ram is born, and my belief is not justiciable. I don't have to give justification to anyone, and that's the judgment of the Supreme Court, that belief is not justiciable.
Rama's picture is there.
Yes, that's what I told you, that in the original books of Constitution, Lord Ram is there. So if Lord Ram is imaginary, the framers of the Constitution need not have that picture also in the book.
I congratulate. Just 1 minute, please. 1 minute, just 1 minute.
Thank you all the audience.
Not just 1
Just
minute.
couple of minutes, please.
I congratulate Mr. Shankar Jain on an excellent proposition, and he has brought so many hidden facts for us, and he also told about the Kashi and Mathura, and really I congratulate him at this young age. He got into this line, and without expecting much money from the other things, he said you are doing everything free. Really I congratulate you, and wish you a bright future, and all the best in your future endeavors, sir. I think you will succeed in all your endeavors, and I once again congratulate you. On behalf of the Sardar Patel College, I really thank you for accepting our invitation and coming over here to address us, and for sparing your valuable time. Really, I congratulate you, sir. Thank you very much.
Just couple of minutes, gentlemen. Couple of minutes. This program would have been not complete with the coordination of Sri Dr. Mohan Gupta. I take the privilege to invite Dr. Mohan Gupta and Vajpayee Sir, President Sardar Patel College alumni, as a token of respect. One moment.